The whisper of gunsmoke. Some legends never die, they just reload. The West wasn't won with mercy. As dawn breaks over the rugged frontier town of Sagebrush Creek, a lone figure moves with military precision behind the weathered bar of the crossroads. Tavern Mason Reed, a name as plain as the man appears to be, polishes a whiskey glass with the same methodical care. A veteran shows cleaning his service weapon. His calloused hands bear the telltale scars of a man who's seen combat. Vietnam, perhaps the old-timers might guess, but they'd be wrong. The town sleeps peacefully, unaware that its salvation rests in the hands of a man who's killed more men than most soldiers faced in war. A living ghost who traded his Colt for a bartender's rag 5 years ago, but legends cast long shadows, even in whispers. And when the blood-soaked Harlan gang rides into Sagebrush Creek looking for easy prey, they'll discover an inconvenient truth about quiet men. The deadliest rattler never sounds a warning. The late afternoon sun filtered through dust-streaked windows of the Crossroads Tavern, casting amber light across worn floorboards where decades of bootsteps had left their mark. Mason Reed polished a glass with the methodical precision of a man who appreciated the small rituals of ordinary life. His movements were economical, no wasted motion or unnecessary gestures, a habit from another life that had proven useful in his current one. "Mason, have you ever considered taking a day off?" Eleanor Walsh asked, counting the night's earnings behind the bar. She spoke without looking up, but the question carried genuine concern. The corners of Mason's mouth turned up slightly in what passed for a smile these days. "What would I do with myself, Miss Eleanor?" His voice was soft, forcing people to lean in to hear him exactly as he preferred it. The tavern was quiet this afternoon. Old Frank Morris nursed his usual whiskey in the corner, and Dr. Wilson sat with his medical journal at his regular table near the window. Occasionally, Wilson's eyes would meet Mason's in silent understanding. Only the doctor knew why Mason's hands, the same ones that handled delicate glassware with such care, had once been feared across 3 territories. The peaceful routine shattered when Sheriff Thomas strode through the swinging doors, his weathered face creased with worry. "Afternoon, Eleanor Mason." He nodded to them both, then approached the bar. "Got word from Pine Ridge. The Harlan gang's been spotted heading this way." Mason's hands didn't pause in their work, but something flickered in his eyes, a shadow so brief anyone else might have missed it. Eleanor didn't miss much. "Victor Harlan," she asked, her voice dropping. "Thought he and his bunch has stayed up north near the railroad." "Times change." Thomas sighed, accepting the coffee Mason silently placed before him. "They've hit 3 banks in the last month. Latest word says they're moving south, probably looking for easier targets, now that the railroad's beefed up security." Dr. Wilson set aside his journal, listening intently. "How many in his gang now?" "James, 5 that we know of." The sheriff replied. "Harlan, Silas Knox, the Vaughn brothers, and that young hothead Eli Parker. Mean bunch. They don't just rob, they make a show of it, like to humiliate folks before they kill them." Mason's hands finally stilled on the glass he was polishing. His fingers traced an old scar on his right palm, a habit none of them had ever mentioned, but all had noticed. "Sagebrush Creek's got nothing worth their trouble," Eleanor said firmly, as if speaking, it would make it true. "Maybe." Thomas agreed, but his eyes drifted to Mason. "Still might be wise to send word to Fort Davis. Get some extra deputies out here, just in case. Takes 3 days for help to arrive from Fort Davis." Mason spoke softly, resuming his work. "If they're coming, they'll be here sooner than that." The sheriff studied him for a long moment. "You seem mighty sure about that." "Just arithmetic, Sheriff. Nothing more." But his words carried a weight that made the room feel suddenly smaller. As evening approached, Charlotte Hayes arrived for her nightly performance, her auburn hair catching the last rays of sunlight as she sat up near the piano. Her voice, when she began to warm up, was sweet and clear, a touch of beauty in a town that often had too little of it. "Rider coming," Eleanor announced from her spot by the window. Moving fast, Mason's hands remained steady as he arranged bottles on the shelf, but his stance shifted almost imperceptibly. To most, he still looked like nothing more than a simple bartender preparing for the evening rush. But Sheriff Thomas saw how the man's weight had settled on the balls of his feet, ready to move in any direction. The sound of thundering hooves grew louder. then stopped abruptly outside the tavern. The swinging doors burst open, revealing a young ranch hand, his face flushed with exertion and fear. Sheriff Thomas, he gasped. They're coming. The Harlan gang. They just shot up Pine Ridge, killed the sheriff and his deputies. They're headed this way. In the sudden silence that followed, Mason carefully set down the bottle he was holding. His movements were still measured, still precise, but now they carried an entirely different quality, like a mountain lion uncoiling before a leap. How far? Thomas demanded. 2 hours, maybe less. They're moving fast, and the ranch hand swallowed hard. They're killing everyone in their path. Eleanor's hand went to her throat. Mother of God, get word to everyone, Thomas ordered. Tell them to bar their doors and windows. Nobody on the streets after dark. He turned to Eleanor. Might want to close up early tonight. No! Mason's quiet voice cut through the tension like a knife. Keep the tavern open, just like any other night. They all turned to look at him, but his eyes were fixed on something distant, seeing perhaps not the bottle-lined shelves before him, but something from long ago. Mason. Eleanor's voice held a question. Some folks need to learn, he said softly, that the quietest snake strikes the deepest. Evening crept into Sagebrush Creek like a thief, bringing with it an unseasonal chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The Crossroads Tavern maintained its usual appearance, but tension hung in the air, as thick as tobacco smoke. Charlotte's usual song seemed more melancholy than ever, her voice carrying notes of warning that everyone felt but nobody mentioned. Sheriff Thomas had positioned himself by the window, occasionally glancing down the darkening street. The few patrons who remained hunched over their drinks, speaking in whispers, as if afraid their voices might carry beyond the tavern walls. Even old Frank had sobered up enough to notice the change in atmosphere, his rheumy eyes darting between the door and Mason's steady presence behind the bar. 2 riders coming in from the south. Thomas announced, his hand instinctively moving to his gun belt. The tavern fell silent, save for the soft clink of glasses as Mason continued his work. The riders turned out to be nothing more than traveling salesmen seeking shelter for the night, but their news brought no comfort. Passed through Pine Ridge this morning. The older of the 2 men said, hands shaking slightly as he lifted his whiskey. Never seen anything like it. They didn't just rob the bank. They made examples of anyone who looked at them wrong. Sheriff Daniels. He trailed off, taking another drink. What about Sheriff Daniels? Eleanor pressed, though her face suggested she didn't really want to know. They made him watch while they shot his deputies, then they tied him to his horse and... The salesman couldn't finish. Dr. Wilson, who had returned to the tavern, despite the growing danger, spoke up from his corner. How many dead? 7 that I counted, would have been more. But it seems they wanted to leave enough folks alive to spread the word about what happens when you stand up to the Harlan gang. Mason's movements had slowed almost imperceptibly as he listened. To most, he appeared absorbed in his task of inventory, but Eleanor noticed how his right hand kept straying to a spot under the bar, where she knew a shotgun had hung unused for the past 5 years. The younger salesman, trying to lighten the mood, attempted a joke. Lucky for us, we've got a sheriff here, right? Though I reckon even the law might want to think twice about facing Victor Harlan. They say he's got 23 notches on his gun. A strange sound came from behind the bar, something between a scoff and a sigh. All eyes turned to Mason, who had paused in his work. Something funny about that bartender? The young man asked, a slight edge to his voice. 23 notches, Mason said quietly, resuming his task. Man who needs to count that high isn't much of a gunfighter. The salesman's face reddened. What would you know about it? You're just a... That's enough. Eleanor cut in sharply. Mason, could you check the cellar? I think we're running low on that Kentucky bourbon. Mason nodded and moved toward the cellar door. As he passed Dr. Wilson's table, the physician spoke in a voice only Mason could hear. Your old wound bothering you? Not yet, Mason replied softly. But it will be. Charlotte struck up another song, this one about a serpent in the garden, and Sheriff Thomas moved to the bar. Eleanor, a word. He glanced around before continuing in a low voice. You should know I sent a rider to Fort Davis, but even if they send help immediately, They won't get here in time. I know, Eleanor finished. She looked toward the cellar door. James about Mason. The sheriff warned, some secrets are best left buried. But secrets like corpses had a way of rising to the surface. This became apparent when 3 local cowhands burst into the tavern, their faces pale with fear. Found Billy Carter's body out by Broken Spoke Creek. One of them reported breathlessly, shot clean through the head execution style. His horse was still saddled, hadn't been dead for more than an hour. The news hit the room like a physical blow. Billy Carter was just a kid, barely 17, who helped his uncle run the general store. They're closer than we thought. Thomas grimaced. Eleanor, maybe now's the time to... The sound of shattering glass cut through the air as the young salesman dropped his bottle. But it wasn't the noise that silenced the room, it was what followed. From somewhere in the darkness outside came the distant but unmistakable sound of gunfire, followed by screams. Mason emerged from the cellar, his face impossible to read, but there was something different about him now. Something in the way he moved, as if the quiet bartender was slowly falling away like an ill-fitting coat. Sheriff, he said, his voice carrying an authority that hadn't been there before. You might want to get these folks home while they can still make it. Thomas studied him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, everyone out. Head straight home, bar your doors. Dasa, he turned to Eleanor. You too. This is my tavern. She started to protest, but Mason interrupted. Please, Miss Eleanor, for once don't argue. Something in his tone made her pause. She'd never heard him speak that way before, like a man who knew exactly what was coming and had seen it all before. As the patrons hurriedly filed out, Dr. Wilson lingered. Need any help? Best get your medical bag ready, Doc, Mason replied, beginning to move bottles from the top shelf to below the bar. Something tells me you'll need it before morning. The sound of distant gunfire came again, closer, this time accompanied by the wild whoops of men who had left their humanity somewhere in the dust of their trail. The Harlan gang was coming, and with them, the end of peace in Sagebrush Creek. As Eleanor finally allowed herself to be led out by Sheriff Thomas, she looked back at Mason. He stood behind his bar as he had countless times before, but now she saw what she'd been blind to all these years. The way he held himself, the deliberate precision of his movements, the watchful eyes that missed nothing. This wasn't just a man who'd seen violence. This was a man who had once been violence itself. The Harlan gang didn't so much enter Sagebrush Creek as they infected it, their arrival bringing a silence that swept through the streets like a prairie fire extinguishing all signs of life. Only the Crossroads Tavern's lights remained bright, a beacon in the growing darkness. Mason heard them before he saw them, the synchronized rhythm of 5 horses moving at a deliberate pace. Not the hurried gallop of men running from the law, but the confident stride of predators who feared nothing in their path. He kept wiping the same glass, his movements unchanged as the sound of boots and spurs grew louder on the wooden sidewalk outside. The swinging doors exploded inward with unnecessary force. Victor Harlan entered first, a tall man with flame-red hair and a scarlet bandana at his throat. His duster was expensive but spattered with dark stains that wouldn't wash out. Behind him came Silas Knox, lean and snake-like, followed by the Vaughn brothers, so similar in appearance they seemed to be reflections of each other. Young Eli Parker brought up the rear, practically bouncing with poorly contained energy. Well, ain't this cozy? Harlan's voice carried the hint of educated roots gone to seed. Seems most establishments in this charming town decided to close early. How hospitable of you to stay open for weary travelers. Mason set down his glass with careful precision. What can I get you, gentlemen? Gentlemen! Knox laughed, the sound like breaking glass. Hear that, Victor? He called us gentlemen. Your best whiskey, Harlan ordered, dropping into a chair and propping his boots on the table. Leave the bottle. Mason reached for the top shelf, his movements measured and deliberate. He could feel their eyes on him, 5 sets of them, watching for any sign of fear or resistance. He gave them neither. You boys aren't from around here, Mason observed quietly, placing the bottle and glasses on their table. What gave it away? Samuel Vaughn, or perhaps it was Daniel grinned. The way you carry your guns, Mason replied, turning back toward the bar. Low on the hip railroad style, nobody out here draws from that position. The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Harlan's eyes narrowed slightly. You seem to know a lot about guns for a bartender. He said, his tone deceptively casual. Man learns things? Mason shrugged, resuming his endless glass polishing. Young Parker, clearly itching to prove himself, drew his pistol with a flourish. Man learns things. Huh, learn anything about this? He spun the gun around his finger, showing off. Learn that's a good way to shoot yourself, Mason replied without looking up. The gang laughed, all except Harlan, who studied Mason with growing interest. You got a name, barkeep? Mason, just Mason, just Mason. Harlan nodded slowly, then without warning, swept his arm across the table, sending bottles and glasses crashing to the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Well, just Mason. Harlan rose, his voice turning ugly. You know what I think? I think you're lying to me. And I don't like being lied to. Hurry, Mason finally looked up, his face impassive. Bottle was $8. The Vaughn brothers burst out laughing, but Harlan silenced them with a look. He approached the bar slowly, like a wolf closing in on prey. $8, that's steep for rot-gut whiskey. He reached into his coat and pulled out a coin, flicking it onto the bar. Here's 2 bits, buy yourself some manners. Mason looked at the coin, then back at Harlan. Still owe $7.75. Silas, Harlan said softly. Show our friend here what we do to mouthy bartenders. Knox grinned and started forward, but at that moment the doors swung open again. Sheriff Thomas stood framed in the doorway, his badge catching the lamplight. Evening, gentlemen, he said, calm as Sunday morning. Might want to reconsider whatever you're thinking. A sheriff in this little dust heap must be our lucky day. Harlan smirked. Way I hear it. Thomas continued, stepping inside. Pine Ridge is missing a sheriff and some deputies. You boys wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Can't say that we do, Harlan replied, though his smile widened. But I did hear something interesting about Pine Ridge. Heard their sheriff was a coward, ran and hid while good men died. His hand drifted toward his gun. You're not a coward, are you, Sheriff? Everything happened at once. Thomas's hand dropped to his holster, but Harlan was faster. The shot echoed like thunder in the confined space. Thomas stumbled backward, red blooming across his chest. James! Mason's voice cracked, for the first time, genuine emotion breaking through his careful facade. Stay behind the bar. Thomas gasped, then crumpled to the floor. Harlan holstered his smoking gun. Now where were we? Ah, yes, teaching some manners to our friend the bartender. Hylas Knox moved forward again, cracking his knuckles. But this time something had changed in Mason's demeanor. His hands had stopped their endless wiping motion. His shoulders had straightened almost imperceptibly, and his eyes had taken on a look that made even Knox hesitate. Been a long time since I killed a man, Mason said softly, almost to himself. Promised myself I was done with it. Kill him, Harlan ordered, annoyed by the delay. Kill him slowly. Sapikun. Knox reached across the bar to grab Mason's shirt, and that's when everything changed. Mason's hand moved faster than seemed humanly possible, catching Knox's wrist and yanking him forward. There was a sharp crack as Knox's face met the solid oak bar. He dropped like a stone, blood pooling beneath his broken nose. Well, well, Harlan drawled, though his hand had dropped back to his gun. Looks like our quiet bartender has some fight in him after all. Shamakul, the Vaughn brothers spread out, flanking the bar. Young Parker bounced on his toes, eager for action, but Mason stood perfectly still, now his eyes fixed on Thomas's motionless form. Last chance, he said, his voice carrying a weight it hadn't possessed before. Take your friend and ride out. Don't make me break my promise. Harlan's laugh was genuine this time. Or what, you'll serve us to death. He drew his gun with lightning speed. I think it's time we... The sound of a shotgun being racked cut through his words. Mason had produced the weapon from under the bar, its double barrels now pointed squarely at Harlan's chest. That's what you had in mind all along, wasn't it? Harlan's smile turned cold. Hiding a scattergun under the bar. Problem is, old man, you can only kill one of us before the others cut you down. True, Mason agreed. Then with deliberate care, he set the shotgun on the bar. That's why I won't be using it. His right hand dropped to his side where no gun had been visible moments before, but now somehow a well-worn Colt gleamed in his grip as if it had materialized from thin air. Been a while, Mason said softly, since anyone called me the Desert Ghost. The name fell into the room like a stone into still water, creating ripples of recognition across the faces of Harlan's gang. Even Silas Knox, still groggy from his encounter with the bar, stopped trying to stem his bleeding nose. The Desert Ghost. Young Parker whispered, his earlier bravado evaporating. That's just a story. They say he died years ago. Stories, Mason said quietly, his gun unwavering, have a way of coming back to life. Harlan's face had lost some of its color, but his arrogant smile remained fixed. I heard of you. They say you killed 30 men in a single year. Say you could shoot a man's gun out of his hand at 50 paces. If I'd killed that many, Mason replied, I wouldn't have bothered counting. The Vaughn brothers exchanged glances, their synchronized movements betraying their nervousness. They had spread out too far trying to flank the bar and now found themselves exposed. Boy, Mason addressed Parker without taking his eyes off Harlan. I'm going to give you a chance your friends won't get. You're young enough to learn from mistakes. Walk out now, leave your gun, and don't stop riding till you hit Mexico. Parker looked uncertainly at Harlan, who spoke through clenched teeth. You take one step toward that door, boy, and I'll kill you myself. Behind the bar, Mason shifted his weight slightly. The movement was almost imperceptible, but it caused all 5 men to flinch. Last chance, kid, be smart. For a moment, the young gunslinger seemed to waver. Then his face hardened. No one calls me kid. His hand dropped to his gun. What happened next was so fast it seemed like a single motion. Parker drew his gun, clearing leather with impressive speed, but Mason was faster, impossibly faster. His first shot took Parker's gun hand, spinning the weapon away in a spray of blood. His second caught the young man's shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the floor. The Vaughn twins drew in perfect unison, their movements mirror images of each other. Mason's gun seemed to speak twice more without him even looking in their direction. Both twins stumbled backward, clutching their gun arms, their weapons clattering to the floor. You've lost your edge, ghost. Harlan sneered, though sweat had broken out on his forehead. Time was you'd have killed them all. Still might, Mason replied calmly. Depends on what happens next. Silas Knox had managed to regain his feet, blood still streaming from his nose. His hand strayed toward his gun. I wouldn't, Mason warned. You're slower than the others, and I've got 1 bullet left. 1 bullet? Harlan laughed, but there was a hysterical edge to it. Against the 2 of us, those aren't good odds, old man. Better than you think. Mason's eyes flickered to Thomas's still form. James was more than just a sheriff to me. He was there that day in Laramie when I hung up my guns. Made me promise to stop killing. Made me swear I'd find another way. His voice grew softer. But he's dead now, and that promise died with him. A movement caught Mason's eye. Eleanor Walsh stood in the doorway, a rifle in her hands. She had returned despite his warnings, drawn by the sound of gunfire. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. She understood, stepping back into the shadows. Laramie, Harlan said slowly, recognition dawning. That's where you killed Blackjack Morrow and his whole gang. 8 men, they say. Ninas, Mason corrected. People always forget about the lookout. And now you, Knox spat blood onto the floor. How the mighty have fallen. Man needs peace. Mason replied, I found mine here until you brought war to my door. Outside thunder rumbled, a storm approaching, or perhaps just the echo of the earlier gunfire. The wounded men groaned softly, but no one moved to help them. Way I see it, Harlan said, his voice taking on a reasonable tone. We're at a stalemate. You're good, maybe the best there ever was, but you can't watch all of us at once. The minute you turn to shoot one, the other will put you down. True, Mason agreed. If I were still the man who needed to outdraw his enemies, He nodded toward the shotgun still lying on the bar. But I own a tavern now and a tavern owner. Well, he likes to keep a few surprises under the bar. Harlan's eyes widened as he spotted the thin wire running from behind the bar to the shotgun's trigger. Mason's boot was resting on something, a pedal, probably salvaged from an old piano. First man to draw, Mason explained quietly. Gets both barrels, won't even need to aim. After that, he shrugged. Like you said, one bullet left. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the wounded had stopped their moaning, sensing the tension building toward its breaking point. You're bluffing, Knox growled, but his hand had moved away from his gun. Maybe, Mason agreed. Question is who wants to find out first. A drop of sweat rolled down Harlan's temple. His fingers twitched near his gun, but he didn't draw. The legend of the desert ghost had grown over the years, but the reality standing before them was somehow more terrifying than the stories. We could still work this out, Harlan said, forcing a smile. Way I hear it, you used to ride with some pretty rough men yourself. Maybe we could... You killed my friend. Mason interrupted, his voice colder than anyone in the room had ever heard it. There's only one way this works out now. Behind them, Dr. Wilson had silently entered through the back door and was checking Thomas's pulse. He caught Mason's eye and gave a slight nod. The sheriff was alive barely. The knowledge seemed to change something in Mason's demeanor. When he spoke again, his voice carried an edge of finality. I've spent 5 years serving drinks to good men and bad, listening to their stories, watching their habits, learning how each man draws, how each man thinks. And you know what I learned. Neither Harlan nor Knox answered, but their eyes were fixed on his gun hand. I learned that the quiet ones, Mason's finger tightened imperceptibly on the trigger, are always the most dangerous. Thunder rolled outside as Dr. Wilson worked frantically to save Sheriff Thomas's life. The wounded Vaughn brothers huddled in a corner, while young Parker lay unconscious, his bleeding slowed by a makeshift tourniquet. The standoff between Mason, Harlan, and Knox had stretched into a deadly silence. You know, Harlan said, his voice unnaturally calm, I heard another story about the desert ghost. They say you disappeared after Laramie because of a woman. That true? Something flickered in Mason's eyes, a shadow of old pain. Hit a nerve, did I? Harlan's smile widened. They say she died. Say you weren't fast enough to save her. Victor, Knox warned, seeing something change in Mason's expression. Rebecca, Mason said softly, the name falling from his lips like a prayer. Her name was Rebecca. Eleanor, still watching from the shadows near the door, saw Mason's hands tremble slightly, the first sign of emotion he had shown all night. Ah, so it is true. Harlan pressed his advantage. The great desert ghost brought low by a woman's death. Tell me, did she die quick, or... The shotgun roared its double blast, deafening in the confined space. Harlan and Knox dove in opposite directions as splinters exploded from the wall behind, where they had been standing. Mason's boot had pressed the pedal, but he hadn't aimed to kill, only to scatter them. That was your surprise under the bar. Harlan laughed, rolling to his feet. Now what? Now, Mason said quietly, we do this the old way. His gun seemed to materialize in his hand again, but this time Harlan was ready. Both men fired simultaneously. Mason's bullet took Harlan's hat off, while Harlan's shot creased Mason's shoulder, tearing his shirt and drawing blood. First blood to me. Harlan grinned, but his smile faded as he saw Mason hadn't even flinched. You know why they called me the Desert Ghost? Mason asked, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. Wasn't for the obvious reasons. Wasn't because I was quiet or fast or deadly, though I was all those things. He stepped out from behind the bar for the first time, his movements liquid smooth, despite his wound. It was because of what Sheriff Thomas taught me back when he was just Deputy James and I was just another angry kid with a fast gun. Shut up and fight, Harlan snarled, but his voice shook slightly. James taught me that a man's shadow is always with him, but you only see it when there's light. Mason took another step forward. He taught me that every killer, every murderer, every man who thinks his gun makes him important, they all cast shadows too. And if you watch those shadows long enough, His gun barked once more, and Knox screamed, his hidden derringer, half drawn from his boot, clattered across the floor. You can see what they're going to do before they do it. I don't... Impossible. Knox gasped, clutching his bleeding hand. You couldn't have seen 5 years. Mason continued, his eyes never leaving Harlan. 5 years I've watched men draw their guns in this tavern, watch their shoulders tense, their weight shift, their shadows move across the floor. 1,000 little tells that say when a man's about to kill. Fascinating lesson, Ghost. Harlan sneered, though he had gone pale. Why did you become a bartender? To study your prey? For the first time, real emotion crept into Mason's voice. I became a bartender because James showed me there was more to life than killing. He taught me that a man's worth isn't measured by his speed with a gun or the notches on his belt. He taught me about peace. Peace, Harlan laughed harshly. Peace is for cowards. Peace is for what? Peace. Mason cut him off, is for men who've seen enough death to know its true cost. James taught me that, Rebecca taught me that, and for 5 years I lived it. Until now, Harlan said softly. Until now. Mason agreed. Dr. Wilson's voice cut through the tension. I've got the bleeding stopped, but he needs proper care. And soon. You hear that? Mason's voice hardened. The man you shot, the man who taught me everything I know about being human instead of just being a killer. He's still alive, which means my promise to him still holds. Something like hope flickered across Harlan's face. So you won't... But here's what James never understood. Mason continued as if Harlan hadn't spoken. Sometimes a man has to break a promise to keep a bigger one. Sometimes peace can only be protected by men willing to do violence. Thunder crashed again, closer now, and rain began to patter against the windows. In that moment, Eleanor saw the transformation complete, saw the quiet bartender she'd known for 5 years become something else entirely. The desert ghost no longer seemed like just a legend. I know what you're thinking, Mason said softly. You're thinking that even if I am who I say I am, it's been 5 years. You're thinking, maybe I've lost my edge, gotten soft serving drinks to cowboys and settlers? His gun disappeared into its holster. A holster that somehow seemed more visible now, as if it had always been there waiting. You're thinking, he continued, that you're still faster than some washed-up legend, that the stories about me were just that. Stories, weren't they? Harlan's hand hovered near his gun. No, Mason said simply, they weren't stories. They were warnings. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the room in stark white. In that frozen moment, Eleanor saw them all like figures in a photograph. Harlan coiled to strike Knox, bleeding on the floor. The Vaughn brothers huddled in their corner, Dr. Wilson working desperately over Thomas's still form, and Mason stood like a man who had finally stopped pretending to be something he wasn't. The shadow had returned. Last chance, he said quietly. Surrender, face the law, live to see another sunrise. Harlan's smile was terrible to behold. You know I won't. No. Mason agreed, his voice heavy with certainty. You won't? The rain drummed against the tavern windows, nature's own percussion for the deadly dance about to unfold. Lightning flickered again, and in its stark illumination, Mason's shadow stretched across the floor, long and dark like the reputation that had followed him all these years. Before this goes any further, Mason said, his voice carrying the weight of experience, there's something you should know about watching men die. Harlan's eyebrows rose slightly. And what's that? It changes you every time. Each death leaves a mark that can't be washed away. Mason's eyes drifted to the wounded men around the room. That's another thing James taught me. Why he made me swear to find another way. Touching, Harlan sneered, but his eyes betrayed his unease. Is this how the great desert ghost fights now? By talking his enemies to death? No, Mason replied calmly. This is how he gives them a chance to live. His gaze swept the room. All of you listen carefully, because these next few minutes will determine who walks out of here. Eleanor, still by the door, saw something she'd never witnessed before. Mason was teaching just as Sheriff Thomas had once taught him, but his lesson was painted in shades of survival and death. Most men, Mason continued, Think gunfighting is about who can draw fastest, shoot straightest. He shook his head slowly. But it's about reading. About knowing. As if to demonstrate, his hand moved like lightning, drawing and firing in one fluid motion. The bullet knocked Knox's second hidden gun, this one from his sleeve, across the floor, before the man could fully produce it. Like knowing when a man's about to do something stupid? Mason added quietly. Knox cursed, clutching his newly bleeding hand. The Vaughn brothers pressed themselves further into their corner. Their earlier bravado completely evaporated. You've been watching us, Harlan realized aloud. All this time we've been talking, reading us like you said, 5 years serving drinks. Mason nodded. You learned to read men, the way they stand, the way they breathe, the way their eyes move. His voice took on an instructor's tone. Like how your right foot turns out slightly before you draw, or how Knox's left eye twitches when he's about to try something foolish. Harlan's face darkened. You think knowing our tells makes you invincible? No, Mason replied, but it means I can do this. His gun disappeared into its holster again. He turned his back on Harlan, walking to the bar with measured steps. Behind him, Harlan's hand darted toward his gun. I wouldn't, Mason said without turning. Your weight's on your back foot, you'd miss. Harlan's hand froze, his face a mask of frustrated rage. You're just guessing. Am I? Mason picked up a bottle, poured 2 glasses. Your breathing change shortened. Your spurs clinked when you shifted your weight. The floorboard under your left boot creaked. He turned, holding both glasses. Little things, things most men never notice. He set 1 glass at each end of the bar. But James noticed them, taught me to notice them too, turned me from a fast gun into something else entirely. A bartender. Harlan spat. A student. Mason corrected. Every man who walked into this tavern taught me something. How bullies telegraph their punches, how liars blink too often, and how killers— He looked directly at Harlan. Can't keep their eyes off their target. As if to prove his point, Harlan's gaze darted to Mason's gun hand, then back to his face. The desert ghost. One of the Vaughn twins whispered, they say he could shoot a man's gun hand at 50 paces in pitch darkness. Could, Mason agreed, can because James taught me that in darkness you don't need to see. You listen, you feel, you know, to demonstrate. He closed his eyes. Right now Knox is trying to inch toward the shotgun on the floor. The Vaughn boys are thinking about making a break for the back door. And you, Harlan, his eyes opened. You're wondering if you can get to that derringer in your vest before I can draw. The outlaw's face went pale. No one had seen the hidden gun. It was completely concealed by his vest. How? The way your vest hangs, the slight bulge, the way you keep your left elbow tucked in. Mason's voice was almost gentle now. Details, always details. Dr. Wilson spoke up from where he worked on Thomas. The sheriff's stable, but his pulse is weak. He needs a doctor's office, proper tools. Mason nodded without taking his eyes off Harlan. Then it's time to end this one way or another. You can't handle all of us at once, Harlan said, but his voice lacked conviction. Don't need to. Already know what you're all going to do. Mason's voice hardened slightly. The twins will run. They're cowards at heart. Knox will try something clever and get himself killed. And you, he paused, you'll go for your gun because your pride won't let you do anything else. You're awfully sure of yourself, Harlan growled. No, Mason corrected. I'm sure of you. Men like you, they're all the same. Think their reputation makes them special. Think being feared makes them important. He shook his head slowly. But fear is just another tell, another shadow to read. Lightning flashed again, and this time when the thunder rolled, it seemed to shake the very foundations of the tavern. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof like 1,000 impatient fingers. Last chance, Mason said quietly. Because once this starts, all the lessons in the world won't help you. Once this starts, I stop being the bartender. Stop being a student. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. I become what I was before. What James tried so hard to help me leave behind. And what's that? Harlan asked, though his face suggested he already knew the answer. Mason's reply was simple, final, death walking, The moment shattered like a mirror hitting stone. The Vaughn twins made their break for the back door, just as Mason had predicted. Knox lunged for the fallen shotgun, his movements telegraphed seconds before he began. And Harlan went for his hidden derringer with snake-like speed. But Mason was faster. He'd been faster 5 years ago, and time hadn't changed that truth. His first shot caught the back door's heavy wooden beam, dropping it into place just as the twins reached it. His second knocked the shotgun another foot away from Knox's grasping fingers, and his third sent Harlan's derringer spinning through the air in a spray of blood and splinters from the outlaw's vest pocket. All three shots had come so close together, they sounded like a single rolling thunderclap. "Jesus Christ," one of the twins whispered. "That's 3 bullets." Harlan snarled, clutching his bleeding hand. "How many you got left? Ghost or enough?" Mason replied simply, "More than enough." But Eleanor, still watching from her position near the front door, saw something the others didn't, a slight tightening around Mason's eyes. He'd fired 3 shots in impossibly quick succession, and even legends had their limits. "You're not as fast as you used to be," Harlan taunted, seemingly reading the same signs. "The old ghost would have killed us all by now." "Maybe," Mason agreed. "Or maybe James's lessons went deeper than you think." Thunder crashed outside as if emphasizing his words. The storm had reached its peak, rain hammering against the windows with renewed fury. In the dim light, shadows danced across the walls like restless spirits. "Your reputation," Harlan continued, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone, "says you never miss, never waste a bullet, but you just used 3 shots and we're all still breathing." "Wasn't trying to kill you," Mason replied. "Not yet." That brought Harlan up short. "What?" "Giving you a chance to see what you're up against, to make the smart choice." Mason's eyes swept the room. "All of you, because what happens next that's on your head's not mine." The Vaughn brothers exchanged glances, then slowly raised their hands. "We surrender." One of them said, "The kid was right. This ain't worth dying over." "Cowards," Harlan spat, but Mason was already moving with smooth efficiency. He pulled 2 pairs of handcuffs from behind the bar where they'd hung next to the shotgun all these years, and slid them across the floor to the twins. "Put them on each other," he ordered tight. "I'll know if you don't." As the twins complied, Knox made his move. He'd been inching toward a broken bottle, its jagged edge gleaming in the lamplight, but before he could grasp it, Mason's boot came down on his wrist. 5 years, Mason said softly, applying pressure, until Knox gasped in pain. 5 years I watched men like you plan desperate things, saw it in their eyes, their hands, the way they looked at broken glass or empty bottles. He increased the pressure slightly. "Amazing what a man learns, tending bar." "You're enjoying this," Harlan accused. "All that talk about peace, about James's lessons. You're loving every minute of being the ghost again." For the first time, something like doubt flickered across Mason's face. Eleanor saw it, and her heart clenched because Harlan was right. There was a part of Mason that had awakened, a deadly part that moved with the fluid grace of a predator. "Maybe," Mason admitted quietly, "maybe that's why James made me promise to stop, because he saw what I couldn't. How easy it is to become what you're fighting." "Then you're no better than us." Harlan pressed his advantage. "Just another killer with a fancy name." "No." The word came not from Mason but from Dr. Wilson. The physician looked up from tending Thomas, his hands bloody, but his eyes clear. "You're wrong about him, dead wrong," Wilson continued despite Mason's warning look. "I've watched this man serve drinks to saints and sinners alike for 5 years. Watched him break up fights with words instead of fists, help drunks home instead of letting them freeze, extend credit to families down on their luck." The doctor's voice grew stronger. "That's not a killer wearing a bartender's mask. That's a good man wearing the ghost's gun." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with truth. Even Harlan appeared momentarily at a loss. "Cuff him," Mason ordered Knox, tossing another pair of handcuffs. "Behind his back. You try anything clever, and I'll show you just how much of the ghost is still in me." Knox, his wrist still aching from Mason's boot, complied with shaking hands. The Vaughn twins sat quietly in their corner, their own cuffs glinting in the lamplight. You really think this ends with us behind bars? Harlan laughed as the cuffs clicked shut. The minute word gets out that the Desert Ghost is alive, every gunslinger from here to Texas will come looking for you. Your quiet life, your peace, it's over. Maybe, Mason agreed. But right now, all I care about is getting James to a doctor. The rest, he shrugged. The rest is tomorrow's problem. Then you're a fool, Harlan sneered, because tomorrow's problems have a way of showing up today. As if on cue, hoofbeats thundered outside the saloon, many hoofbeats growing louder by the second. Ah, Harlan's smile was terrible to behold. Right on time. Mason's expression didn't change, but his grip tightened almost imperceptibly on his gun. Eleanor, he called softly, get Doc and James out the back. Now. Mason. Eleanor started to protest, but he cut her off. The rest of Harlan's gang, he said quietly, the ones who weren't with him in Pine Ridge, the ones I should have known were coming. His eyes met hers. Get them out, please. The hoofbeats stopped outside. Boots' steps approached the tavern doors, accompanied by the jingle of spurs and the metallic click of weapons being readied. Well, Ghost, Harlan's smile widened. Still think you can read every man's intentions? No, Mason replied, moving to stand between the approaching footsteps and his wounded friend. But I can read yours, and I know what's coming through that door isn't near as dangerous as what's already inside. Lightning flashed once more, and in its brilliant glare, the Desert Ghost's silhouette seemed to grow, spreading across the floor like a promise or a warning. The saloon doors creaked open, slowly, deliberately. Through the gap came the gleam of gun barrels, maybe 10 of them. The storm's fury painted everything in shades of shadow and lightning, turning the armed men into looming silhouettes. Quite a reunion, the lead figure drawled, stepping into the light. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face carved from granite and eyes like chips of ice. The famous Desert Ghost tending bar in a dusty nowhere town. Almost didn't believe it when the boys rode out to tell us, Marcus Reynolds, Mason said quietly. Still riding with trash, I see. Still breathing, Reynolds corrected, his eyes taking in the scene, his captured companions. The wounded men, the growing pool of blood around Sheriff Thomas. Which is more than I can say for some folks. More men filed in behind him, spreading out with practiced precision, Eleanor still trying to help Dr. Wilson move. Thomas counted 8 guns, all pointed at Mason. Eleanor, Mason's voice was soft but carried an edge of steel. Get James out now. Connor, nobody's going anywhere. Reynolds commanded. His men shifted to block both exits. Not until we settle some old business. Harlan, still handcuffed, laughed from his position on the floor. Told you there'd be complications. Ghost Marcus has been running what's left of the Morrow gang since you killed old Blackjack. Laramie, Reynolds nodded. Been a long time since anyone spoke that name, but some debts don't fade with time. Mason's gun hadn't moved, still trained on Harlan, but his eyes scanned the room, reading angles, distances, shadows. Your brother made his choice in Laramie. He said to Reynolds, same as Blackjack did. My brother was 17. Reynolds' voice cracked like a whip. Your brother was a killer, Mason corrected. Same as you, same as Blackjack. He chose his path. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the hatred in Reynolds' eyes. And you chose to gun him down, shot him in the back while he was running. No, Mason's denial was flat absolute. I shot him in the front while he was drawing on a woman and her child. I saw his eyes when he died. He knew what he was doing, just like you know what you're doing now. The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. Dr. Wilson had managed to get Thomas into a sitting position against the wall, but the sheriff's breathing was labored. 8 guns, Reynolds said softly. 8 experienced killers against 1 washed-up legend playing bartender. How do you like those odds, Ghost? Better than you'd think, Mason's voice remained steady. Because I've been watching your men since they walked in. The one by the window, he's favoring his right leg. Old injury probably slows his draw. The 2 by the bar are standing too close together. They'll get in each other's way. The one behind you is scared, his gun hand's shaking so bad, he's likely to shoot one of his own. Reynolds' eyes narrowed. You always talk too much. Part of being a bartender, Mason replied, you learn to read people, learn their habits, their fears, like how your left eye twitches when you're about to draw, just like it did in Laramie just before your brother died. The words hit Reynolds like physical blows, his face contorted with rage. Kill him, he roared. Kill him now. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion, yet was over in seconds. Mason moved like liquid shadow, his gun barking 3 times before anyone could react. The first shot took out the lamp above Reynolds' head, plunging half the room into darkness. The second caught the floorboard at the feet of the 2 men by the bar, sending them stumbling into each other. The third hit the window behind the injured gunman, making him duck instinctively. In the confusion, Mason rolled behind an overturned table as guns blazed, bullets splintering wood and shattering bottles filling the air with the smell of gunpowder and spilled whiskey. "Get James out," Mason shouted to Eleanor over the chaos. "Doc, go with him." Eleanor and Wilson half-carried, half-dragged Thomas toward the back door as Reynolds' men tried to adjust to the darkness. "Spread out," Reynolds commanded. "He's just one man. One man who knows this room better than he knows himself." Mason's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. One man who spent 5 years memorizing every creak in these floorboards, every shadow cast by these lamps, every angle bullets can travel. A shot rang out and one of Reynolds' men screamed, his gun hand suddenly useless. One man, Mason continued, who's had 5 years to prepare for exactly this kind of night? Another shot, another cry of pain. Reynolds' men were shooting at shadows now, at movements glimpsed in lightning flashes, at the ghost of a legend who seemed to be everywhere at once. "You're just proving what I always said," Reynolds shouted into the darkness. "You're a killer ghost, a cold-blooded murderer hiding behind fancy words and a bartender's apron." No, Mason's voice was closer now. "I'm what James taught me to be, a man who chooses his battles, and right now I'm choosing to give your men a chance to walk away." And one of Reynolds' gunmen suddenly bolted for the door, then another. In the storm's flickering light, their fear was plain to see. "Cowards!" Reynolds roared. "Stand and fight." "They're not cowards," Mason said quietly. "They're smart. They figured out what you haven't, that there's a difference between being willing to kill and being willing to die." Only 3 of Reynolds' men remained now, plus Reynolds himself. Harlan watched it all with a mixture of fury and fascination, his earlier bravado replaced by something like awe. "Come on, Ghost," Reynolds challenged, spinning in place, trying to locate his target. "Face me like a man, or are you just going to hide in the dark like the coward who shot my brother?" "I didn't hide then," Mason's voice came from directly behind him. "And I'm not hiding now." Reynolds whirled his gun, coming up, but he was far too late. The desert ghost stood less than 3 feet away, his weapon already leveled. "Your brother died trying to murder innocents," Mason said softly. "Is that really the legacy you want to die for?" Lightning flashed one final time, illuminating them both in stark relief. Reynolds with hatred twisting his features, Mason with the calm certainty of a man who had made peace with violence long ago. And in that frozen moment, Reynolds' left eye twitched. The shot came not from Reynolds, but from behind. One of his remaining men had circled around in the chaos. Mason felt the bullet tear through his left shoulder, spinning him sideways. His own shot at Reynolds went wide, shattering a mirror behind the bar. "Not so legendary now, are you?" Reynolds laughed, regaining his confidence as Mason stumbled against the table. The great desert ghost, bleeding like any other man. Mason's gun hand stayed steady, but blood darkened his shirt at an alarming rate. The wound wasn't fatal, but it was bad enough to matter, to slow him down, to make him human. "Eleanor," he shouted, hearing movement near the back door. "I told you to get out." "Not without you," she called back, and he heard the distinctive sound of her rifle being cocked. "Don't," he warned, but it was too late. Eleanor's shot caught one of Reynolds' remaining men in the leg, dropping him. But the muzzle flash gave away her position, and Reynolds' other man was already turning, his gun rising. Mason didn't hesitate. He threw himself across the room, his injured shoulder screaming in protest, and tackled Eleanor as the outlaw's bullet whistled through the space where she had been. They crashed behind the bar together as bottles exploded overhead. "Touching!" Reynolds' voice dripped with mockery. "The ghost does have a heart after all." Makes me wonder. A pause then. Bring the marshal back in here. Mason's blood ran cold as he heard the sounds of struggle. One of Reynolds' men must have circled around outside. He had Dr. Wilson at gunpoint, forcing him and Thomas back through the door. Let them go. Mason called out, his voice steady, despite the pain. This is between us. No, Reynolds replied. This is about family, about watching the ones you love die just like I had to watch my brother die. The great desert ghost brought low by the same weakness that retired him in the first place. You care too much. Eleanor tried to rise, but Mason held her down as more bullets splintered the bar above them. Stay still, he whispered. Please. You can't save them all. Ghost, Reynolds shouted. Just like you couldn't save that woman in Laramie. What was her name, Rebecca? The name hit Mason like a physical blow. 5 years of peace, of trying to forget, crashed down around him. He saw Rebecca's face, heard her last words, felt her blood on his hands all over again. That's right. Reynolds pressed his advantage. The boys told me all about her, how you tried to leave the life behind for her, how Blackjack's gang found you anyway, how you weren't fast enough to save her. Don't. Mason's voice was barely a whisper. And now history repeats itself. Reynolds's boots creaked on the floorboards as he moved closer. The sheriff who tried to save your soul, the woman who gave you a chance at a new life, the doctor who kept your secrets, which one should die first? Eleanor's hand found Mason in the darkness behind the bar. Whatever happens, she whispered, you gave us 5 years of peace. That's worth something. But Mason barely heard her. His mind was racing backward through time to that night in Laramie, when it had all gone wrong, when he'd been too confident, too sure of himself, too convinced that his reputation would keep Rebecca safe. I can't, he started, his voice cracking. Can't what? Reynolds taunted. Can't save them, can't bear to watch them die, or can't admit that everything James taught you about peace was a lie. The storm outside had begun to fade, the thunder growing more distant. In the relative quiet, Mason could hear Thomas's labored breathing, Dr. Wilson's attempts to keep him steady, Eleanor's heart pounding next to him. You know what your problem is? Ghost. Reynolds continued. You never understood what this life really means. It's not about being the fastest or the deadliest. It's about being willing to do whatever it takes to sacrifice anyone and anything to win. Mason closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his gun, the burn of his wound, the tremor in his hands that came not from fear, but from something deeper, the knowledge that whatever he did next would define him forever. You're right, he said finally, his voice carrying clearly through the smoky air. I do care too much, always have. He squeezed Eleanor's hand once, then let go. That's what James saw in me all those years ago. Not just a fast gun, but a man who could feel the weight of every trigger, pull every life taken. Philosophy won't save them. Reynolds sneered. No, Mason agreed, but it might save you. He raised his voice. All of you listen carefully. In about 10 seconds, I'm going to stand up. I'm going to drop my gun, and then you're going to have a choice. The only choice, Reynolds laughed, is which one dies first. Wrong. Mason's voice had changed, becoming something ancient and terrible. The choice is whether you want to be the men who killed an injured sheriff, a doctor, trying to save lives, and an innocent woman, or the men who walked away and lived to tell about it. You're in no position to make threats, Reynolds said, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. Not a threat, Mason replied, a prophecy. Because if you harm any of them, if you spill one more drop of innocent blood in this tavern, he took a deep breath, then the desert ghost stops trying to save your lives and goes back to what he does best. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wounded had stopped their moaning, sensing something momentous about to unfold. You're bluffing, Reynolds said finally, but his voice shook slightly. Am I? Mason asked softly. You've heard the stories. You know what I can be again. So ask yourself, do you really want to force that choice? Do you want to be the one who brings death back to life? Eleanor felt him shifting beside her, preparing to rise. Mason, she whispered, don't. But he was already standing, his gun held loosely at his side. Blood dripped steadily from his wounded shoulder, but his eyes were what held everyone transfixed. They were no longer the eyes of a bartender or even of a legendary gunfighter. They were the eyes of a man looking into an abyss and choosing to step forward anyway. Time seemed to crystallize in the smoke-filled tavern. Mason stood exposed, his gun pointed at the floor, blood darkening his left sleeve. Reynolds and his remaining men held their positions, weapons trained on their various hostages. Even the storm outside had hushed, as if nature itself was holding its breath. "Drop the gun," Reynolds ordered, but his voice trembled slightly. Mason's weapon hit the floor with a sound like distant thunder. The clatter echoed through the room, emphasized by the absolute silence that followed. "There," Mason said quietly. "Now you have what you wanted, the desert ghost unarmed and bleeding." His eyes found Reynolds's across the room. "Question is, what are you going to do about it?" "Kill him," Harlan called from his position on the floor, still handcuffed. "Kill him now before he tries something." But Reynolds hesitated, and in that hesitation Mason saw something. He recognized the same doubt he'd felt in Laramie the moment before everything changed. "Your brother had that same look," Mason said softly. "Right before he made his choice. Right before he decided that killing was easier than living with doubt." "Shut up." Reynolds' gun wavered slightly. "You don't get to talk about him." I remember every man I've killed." Mason continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Every face, every moment. Your brother's eyes were blue like your mother's. He told me that right before he drew said it was the only good thing he got from her." Reynolds' face went pale. How did you?" "Because I listened," Mason replied simply. "That's what James taught me, that every man, even the ones you have to kill, deserves to be heard, to be remembered." "Boss," one of Reynolds' remaining men called nervously, "something ain't right here." 5 years. Mason went on, taking a small step forward. 5 years I've poured drinks and listened to stories, learned that every man who walks through those doors is carrying something: pain, fear, regret. Another step. Even you, Reynolds, especially you. Stay back. Reynolds' gun tracked Mason's movement, but his hand was shaking now. "You know what I learned most of all." Mason's voice dropped lower, becoming almost gentle. "I learned that the man who needs everyone to fear him is usually the most frightened of all." At that moment, several things happened at once. Dr. Wilson, seeing Reynolds' attention fixed on Mason, shifted his weight to shield the wounded sheriff. Eleanor's hand found the butt of her fallen rifle beneath the bar, and the last of Reynolds' loyal men began backing toward the door. "Now, Hashem," Reynolds shouted, but his men didn't move. They had seen something in Mason's eyes that scared them more than their leader's wrath. "They're not going to shoot," Mason said with quiet certainty, "because they finally understand what James taught me years ago, that there's a difference between being a killer and being a murderer. They'll shoot if I tell them to shoot." Reynolds' voice rose to a desperate pitch. "No." Mason shook his head slowly. "They won't, because they can feel it, what's coming. What happens if they cross that line?" He took another step forward. "You feel it too, don't you, Reynolds? That voice in your head telling you this isn't what your brother would have wanted. You don't know what he wanted." Reynolds' finger tightened on the trigger. "You forced my hand," Mason corrected gently. "Just like you're trying to force it now. But ask yourself, is this really about your brother? Or is it about you trying to live up to a legacy of violence that never brought anyone peace?" Reynolds' gun barrel dipped slightly, uncertainty warring with rage on his face. Behind him, his last 2 men exchanged glances and began moving slowly toward the exit. "You can still walk away," Mason continued, close enough now that Reynolds' gun nearly touched his chest. "Can still choose a different path. That's what James taught me, that it's never too late to change." "Boss," one of the remaining outlaws called from the doorway. "We're leaving. This ain't worth dying for." "Cowards," Reynolds' shout was ragged. "All of you, the great desert ghost is right in front of us, unarmed, and you're running." "No!" Mason's voice was barely a whisper now. "They're not running. They're living something your brother never got the chance to learn. Safranorum." Reynolds's gun pressed against Mason's chest right over his heart. I could kill you right now. End the legend once and for all? Could Mason agreed, but you won't, because you finally figured out what I learned 5 years ago, that pulling a trigger is easy. Living with it afterward, that's the hard part. For a long moment, the only sound was the fading storm and Reynolds' ragged breathing. Then slowly, incredibly, his gun barrel began to lower. What are you doing? Harlan demanded from the floor. Kill him, kill all of them. But Reynolds wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were fixed on Mason's, seeing perhaps for the first time what his brother had seen in those final moments. Not a legend, not a killer, but a man who carried the weight of every life he'd taken. My brother. Reynolds said heavily. He really did draw first? Yes, Mason replied softly. And his last words were about you, about hoping you'd choose a better path. The gun slipped from Reynolds' fingers, hitting the floor with a finality that seemed to echo through the years. Behind him, his last men melted away into the night, leaving only the sound of distant hoofbeats. It's over, Mason said quietly, not just to Reynolds, but to everyone in the room. The killing stops here. Eleanor emerged from behind the bar, her rifle trained on Reynolds, but her eyes on Mason. Dr. Wilson resumed tending to Thomas, whose breathing had steadied, and outside the storm finally broke moonlight, streaming through the windows to paint silver paths across the bullet-scarred floor. Reynolds sank to his knees, years of hatred and vengeance, draining from him like blood from a wound. What happens now? Mason's reply was interrupted by a weak voice from the corner. Now Sheriff Thomas said, struggling to sit up, we all learn to live with our choices, just like I taught him to do all those years ago. The Desert Ghost looked at his old friend, then at the woman who had given him a chance at a new life, then finally at the man who had come to kill him, but found redemption instead. No, he corrected gently, now we learn to live with our choices together. Dawn broke over Sagebrush Creek, painting the sky in shades of gold and promise. The Crossroads Tavern bore the scars of the night's violence, bullet holes in the walls, broken glass glinting on the floor, bloodstains that would never quite wash away, but it still stood much like the man who had defended it. Mason worked methodically behind the bar, his left arm in a sling cleaning glasses, just as he had done every morning for the past 5 years. The routine was the same, but something had changed, not just in him, but in the very air of the place. You don't have to do that now, Eleanor said softly, watching him from the doorway. Dr. Wilson said you need rest. Rest can wait, Mason replied, not looking up. Some things need to be put right first. Through the window, they could see Sheriff Thomas being tended to in Dr. Wilson's office across the street. The lawman would live, though he'd carry another scar to add to his collection. In the jail next door, Reynolds and his surviving men sat quietly in their cells, their fighting spirits broken not by violence, but by understanding, words already spreading. Eleanor continued moving to help him, despite his protests. About what happened here, about who you really are. Who I was, Mason corrected gently. The Desert Ghost died last night along with a lot of old ghosts. Did he? Eleanor's voice carried a hint of doubt. Those men who ran, they'll talk. More will come looking to make a name for themselves. Mason finally stopped his work, looking at her directly. Let them come. They'll find what those before them found, just a bartender who listens more than he shoots. The morning light caught the silver in his hair, the new lines around his eyes. He looked both older and younger somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted, even as a new one settled in its place. You're really going to stay? Eleanor asked, hope warring with concern in her voice. Even after all this? 5 years ago, Mason said slowly, James Thomas found me in Laramie, drowning in guilt and whiskey after Rebecca's death. He could have drawn on me, tried to bring in what was left of the Desert Ghost. Instead, he sat down in order to drink. Talked to me about peace, about choices, about the difference between living and just surviving. He touched the scar on his shoulder, still fresh and painful. Last night, I finally understood what he was trying to teach me. It's not about hanging up your guns or pretending the past never happened. It's about choosing who you want to be every single day. The door creaked open and old Frank shuffled in right on time for his morning drink. He paused, taking in the destruction, then smiled toothlessly. Heard there was some excitement last night, he said, settling onto his usual stool. Sorry I missed it. Mason's lips twitched in what might have been a smile as he poured the old man his usual, some things at least hadn't changed. Town's already talking about rebuilding, Eleanor said, watching Frank take his first sip. Sheriff Thomas says he'll recommend a commendation for how you handled things without killing anyone. I mean, James always did believe in redemption. Mason nodded. Even for men like Reynolds. Maybe especially for men like Reynolds. Through the window, they could see people beginning to emerge from their homes, life returning to Sagebrush Creek. Children played in the street. Women hung laundry. Men nodded respectfully as they passed the tavern. But there was something different in how they looked at the crossroads. Now not fear exactly, but awareness, understanding. You know, Eleanor said thoughtfully, I always wondered why you chose this place. Why here of all the towns you could have disappeared to? Mason was quiet for a long moment, his hands moving automatically through their familiar routine. Because it was quiet, he said finally. Because it needed someone to tend the bar and listen to stories. Because... He paused, looking around at the bullet-scarred walls, the broken bottles, the first rays of sun, painting everything in new light. Because some places, like some people, deserve a second chance. The door opened again, and Dr. Wilson entered, looking exhausted but satisfied. Retry Claude hit the max length for a message and has paused its response. You can write, continue to keep the chat going, and continue edit. I'll continue with the final scenes of the story. The door swung shut behind Dr. Wilson as he made his way to the bar. His fingers, usually so steady in surgery, trembled slightly as he accepted the coffee Mason poured him. Sheriff's asking for you, Wilson said, blowing steam from the cup. Says he wants to talk before the town council meets at noon. Town council, Mason raised an eyebrow. Eleanor nodded. Emergency session. They're trying to decide what to do about, well, everything. The damage, the prisoners, the rumors already spreading down the stage line. And what to do about you, Wilson added quietly. A heavy silence settled over the tavern. Through the window, Mason could see more townspeople gathering in small clusters along the main street. Heads bent in conversation, occasional glances directed toward the crossroads. They're afraid, Mason observed, his voice neutral. Some are, Eleanor replied. Others are grateful. Most are just trying to understand how the quiet bartender they've known for 5 years turned out to be. A ghost story. Mason finished for her. A legend better left buried. Wilson set down his cup with unexpected force. That's not fair to them, Mason. These people stood by you for 5 years, never asking questions about where you came from or what you were running from. Now they've seen what you can do, what you kept hidden from them. They deserve some kind of explanation. And what would you have me tell them, Doc? Mason asked, his voice carrying no hint of challenge. Only genuine inquiry, that I've killed more men than I can count, that I spent 20 years letting the legend grow because it kept people afraid enough to leave me alone. That even now, his hand drifted unconsciously to his gun. Part of me is listening for bootsteps and counting shadows. Eleanor moved closer, her hand coming to rest gently on his good arm. Tell them the truth, that you're a man who made mistakes, who found a measure of peace here, and who was willing to risk everything to defend it when it mattered. Before Mason could respond, the tavern door opened again. This time it was Charlotte Hayes, the songstress, her face drawn with exhaustion but her eyes bright with purpose. They're saying out there that you killed 15 men last night, she said without preamble. Some are saying 20. I didn't kill anyone, Mason replied quietly. I know that, Charlotte nodded. I've been telling everyone who'll listen, but stories spread faster than truth, especially when they have got the desert ghost in them. I wondered if you'd recognize the name, Mason said. Charlotte smiled sadly. My father was a lawman in Colorado Territory. He used to tell me bedtime stories about the man who moved like a shadow and never missed a shot. Never thought I'd be singing in his saloon. The morning light caught something in her hand, a folded piece of paper, creased and worn. She approached the bar and set it down carefully before Mason. What's this? he asked, not reaching for it. List of names. She replied, every family in Sagebrush Creek who's taken charity from you over the years. Every time you've extended credit when crops failed or winter ran long. Every medical bill you've quietly paid when Doc wasn't looking. She nodded toward Wilson, whose eyes had widened in surprise. Every time you stepped between a drunk and his wife or walked someone home who couldn't make it on their own? Mason stared at the paper as if it might bite. How did you? Eleanor's been keeping books for 5 years, Charlotte said. And I listen as much as you do. Different kind of listening maybe, but you hear things when you're singing and people think no one's paying attention. The door swung open again, and this time it was Sheriff Thomas himself who entered, leaning heavily on a cane, his chest bandaged beneath his partially buttoned shirt. The tavern fell silent as he made his way painfully to the bar. Should you be up? Mason asked, already reaching for a chair. Thomas waved him off. I've been shot before. This one just came closer to its mark than most. He settled onto a bar stool with a grimace. Council's meeting in an hour. Wanted to talk to you first. James. Mason began, but the sheriff cut him off. Just listen for once. Thomas said, his voice carrying the weight of command despite his weakened state. This town owes you their lives, every man, woman, and child who would have been at the mercy of Harlan's gang if you hadn't been here. But that's not a debt they know how to repay, Mason. Not when it comes attached to a name like yours. Mason's face remained impassive, but Eleanor saw something flicker in his eyes, a shadow of old pain, or perhaps simply resignation. The Desert Ghost. Wilson mused. All these years, I thought it was just another tall tale. Something to scare children and reassure gamblers. It was, Mason said, until it wasn't. He looked directly at Thomas. What are you trying to tell me, James? That you have a choice to make, the sheriff replied. One way or another, by sundown, the man behind this bar needs to be someone the town can understand. Either Mason Reed stays and the ghost disappears for good, or the ghost rides on, and Mason Reed was just another shadow. Mason finished softly. Thomas nodded, once his face grave. I can give you until the council meeting to decide, but they'll want answers, not riddles. The sheriff stood with difficulty, waving away offers of help. 5 years ago, I helped a man who needed to disappear, he said, moving slowly toward the door. Today I'm asking that man to decide if he's found something worth of staying visible for him. The door closed behind him, leaving the tavern in a silence broken only by the distant sounds of the awakening town. Eleanor looked at Mason, her eyes searching his face for some hint of his thoughts. What will you do? Mason's hand moved to the list of names. Charlotte had left his fingers tracing the paper without actually lifting it. I've been running for so long, he said finally. I'm not sure I remember how to stand still when the world can see me. Maybe you don't have to remember, Eleanor suggested. Maybe you just need to decide if what you've built here is worth more than what you left behind. Mason nodded slowly, his eyes drifting to the mirror behind the bar, cracked now from a stray bullet, fragmenting his reflection into a dozen different versions of himself. 5 years, he murmured. 5 years to build something, and one night to decide if it's real. Outside, the town bell began to toll, calling the council to session. The town hall of Sagebrush Creek had never held so many people at once. Every bench was filled with townspeople lining the walls and spilling out onto the porch. All conversation ceased when Mason entered, his left arm still in its sling, his face bearing the composed expression that had become as much a part of him as his careful movements. Mayor Simmons, a portly man, whose general store had somehow escaped the violence of the previous night, rapped his gavel for order. Beside him sat the town council, Herbert Walsh, Eleanor's father, and the town's banker. Abigail Winters, who ran the boarding house, Samuel Jenkins, the blacksmith, and Martha Wilson, the doctor's wife, and the town's school teacher. Sheriff Thomas sat slightly apart, his face pale but determined. Mason Reed. The mayor began, his voice carrying an unfamiliar formality. You've been asked to appear before this council to address certain revelations that came to light during last night's incident. Mason nodded, once his saying nothing. Mayor Simmons cleared his throat uncomfortably. It appears that you have been living among us under well, not false pretenses exactly, but without full disclosure of your history. Is that a crime in Sagebrush Creek? Mason asked quietly. The question held no challenge, only curiosity. No, Herbert Walsh said, leaning forward, but harboring a known gunslinger might be, particularly one with your reputation. A murmur ran through the crowd. Mason waited for it to subside before speaking again. I killed no one last night, he said simply, and I've broken no law in 5 years of living here. That's true enough, Sheriff Thomas confirmed. Mason's been nothing but an asset to this community since the day he arrived. An asset? Jenkins the blacksmith scoffed. We invited a wolf into our hen house, James. You knew what he was all along, and you said nothing. I knew what he had been, Thomas corrected, and I knew what he was trying to become. And what was that exactly? Martha Wilson asked, her schoolteacher's voice cutting through the tension. What does a man like the Desert Ghost try to become, Mason? For the first time, Mason seemed slightly uncomfortable, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for hidden threats, or perhaps just the right words. Invisible, he said finally. Ordinary. The kind of man who could pour drinks and listen to stories and sleep through the night without checking his gun. And did you, she pressed, become that man? Mason's gaze found Eleanor in the crowd. She nodded almost imperceptibly, encouraging him. I thought I had, he admitted, until last night, until I had to choose between keeping my promise to be that man and keeping my promise to protect this town. Another murmur, this one less hostile, moved through the assembly. The fact remains, Mayor Simmons interjected, that your presence here puts us all at risk. You said it yourself last night, Mr. Reed, or should I call you? Mason is fine, he interrupted softly. The other name belongs to someone else, someone I buried 5 years ago. And yet he rose from the grave rather spectacularly last night. Herbert Walsh observed dryly. What's to stop him from rising again? What's to stop every would-be gunslinger and bounty hunter between here and the Mississippi from coming to test their mettle against the legend? Nothing, Mason acknowledged, which is why I've decided to leave. A shocked silence descended on the hall. Even those who had been arguing for his departure seemed taken aback by his quiet declaration. Leave! Eleanor's voice rang out, half question, half accusation. She pushed her way to the front of the crowd. Just like that, after 5 years, you'll just ride away because it's convenient. Because it's necessary, Mason corrected gently. Your father's right, Eleanor. As long as I stay here, Sagebrush Creek will never know peace again. We never knew peace to begin with, she shot back. Who broke up the fights when the cattle drives came through? Who stood between Mrs. Parker and her husband when he came home drunk and mean? Who kept this town safe long before anyone knew who you really were? That wasn't the ghost, Mason said. That was just a man doing what needed doing. Exactly. Eleanor turned to face the council. You all sit there acting like we've just discovered a monster in our midst, but the man who's been serving your drinks and listening to your troubles and helping your children for 5 years, that's the real Mason Reed. That's who he is. The ghost is just a shadow he casts when the sun hits him a certain way. A thoughtful silence followed her words. It was broken surprisingly by old Frank, who had somehow found his way to the meeting despite his usual morning routine at the bar. Reckon I've known Mason longer than most, the old man said, his voice quavering but clear. Never knew he was some famous gunfighter, never cared neither. All I knew was he poured straight and listened well. Extended credit when I was short and cut me off when I'd had enough. He shrugged his bony shoulders. Seems to me a man ought to be judged by what he does, where you can see him, not by stories about what he might have done somewhere else. Martha Wilson leaned forward. Is that how you see it? Mason, that the ghost is just a shadow? Mason considered the question carefully. I wish it were that simple. He said finally, but the truth is, the ghost is as much a part of me as the bartender. I spent 20 years building that legend until it became a cage I couldn't escape. James offered me a key 5 years ago, a chance to be someone else, someone better, and for 5 years it worked. He glanced at Sheriff Thomas, who nodded encouragement. But last night proved that the ghost is still there waiting, and as long as people know where to find him, they'll come looking. They'll bring their vengeance and their pride and their need to make a name for themselves. And next time it might not be just the tavern that bears the scars. Mayor Simmons sighed heavily. So you're determined to leave to protect us from your reputation. I'm determined to protect what matters, Mason replied. Whatever that requires. And what matters to you, Mr. Reed? Abigail Winters asked. It was the first time she'd spoken, and her quiet question seemed to catch Mason off guard. He looked around the room slowly, his eyes lingering on familiar faces. Wilson, Charlotte Hayes, old Frank Sheriff Thomas. Finally, his gaze settled on Eleanor. Peace, he said softly. The chance to build something that lasts longer than a legend or a gun. The hope that when I'm gone, people will remember the drinks I poured, not the men I killed. Eleanor stepped forward closer to him than propriety might allow, her voice low but intense. And if those things are here, if leaving means abandoning them rather than protecting them. Before Mason could answer, the doors at the back of the hall burst open. A young boy, no more than 12, stumbled in, breathless with excitement. Riders coming! He gasped. Lots of them coming fast from the east. The room erupted in panic. Mayor Simmons banged his gavel uselessly as parents grabbed for children and men reached for weapons that weren't there. Quiet. Sheriff Thomas's voice cut through the chaos with surprising strength. When the noise subsided, he turned to Mason. How many? Mason was already moving toward the door, his posture alert but not alarmed. Let me see. The townspeople parted before him, then followed him onto the porch of the town hall. In the distance, a cloud of dust marked the approach of multiple riders, at least a dozen, maybe more. Reynolds had more men. Someone muttered fearfully, They've come back for revenge. No, Mason said, his eyes narrowing against the sun. Those aren't outlaws. As the riders drew closer, their uniforms became visible, the blue of the U.S. cavalry with an officer leading the column. The army. Herbert Walsh asked, confused, What would they want here? The prisoners, most likely, Sheriff Thomas suggested. Word must have spread faster than we thought. The cavalry troop reined in at the edge of town, the officer raising his hand to halt his men. He rode forward alone, a captain by his insignia young, but with eyes that had seen their share of conflict. I'm looking for Sheriff Thomas, he called as he approached the gathered townspeople. Thomas stepped forward, leaning on his cane. I'm Thomas. The captain dismounted smoothly. Captain Williams, 5th Cavalry. We received word about the incident last night. The Harlan gang has been on our wanted list for months. Well, they're in our jail now, Thomas said. What's left of them anyway? The captain nodded, then his eyes scanned the crowd, settling finally on Mason, who had moved slightly apart from the others. Something like recognition flickered across the young officer's face. The report mentioned another name, he said carefully, a name I didn't expect to hear again. The crowd fell silent, all eyes turning to Mason. There are many names in this world. Captain, Mason replied evenly. Not all of them worth remembering. Perhaps, Williams agreed. But some names carry weight. Some names mean something even years after they've been set aside. He reached into his uniform jacket and produced an official-looking document. I have orders regarding the disposition of the prisoners and regarding you, sir. If you are who they say you are. And who do they say I am? Mason asked. The Desert Ghost. Williams said simply, the man who ended the Blackwood Range War without firing a shot. The man who tracked the Clay brothers through 3 territories to bring them to justice. The man who saved a train full of passengers from bandits near Fort Laramie. A confused murmur ran through the crowd. These were not the stories they had expected to hear. Not tales of bloodshed and notches on a gun, but of justice and lives saved. Those are interesting stories, Mason observed. Not all of them accurate. But not all legends are built on blood, sir, Williams replied. Some are built on something else entirely. He held out the document. These orders come directly from the territorial governor. He'd like to speak with you personally. About what? Mason asked, not reaching for the paper. About a position, Williams said, as special marshal for the territory. It seems the governor believes that a man with your particular history might be uniquely qualified to bring order to areas where traditional law enforcement has failed. Sonum. The stunned silence that followed was broken by Sheriff Thomas's surprised laugh. Well, I'll be damned, he said softly. James was right all along. James, Mayor Simmons questioned Governor James McClintock. Thomas explained he was U.S. Marshal for the territory before his appointment. He and Mason crossed paths more than once in the old days. So the governor wants to pin a badge on the Desert Ghost? Herbert Walsh asked incredulously. Make him an official lawman. No, Mason shook his head. The governor wants to pin a badge on a ghost, but that man died 5 years ago in Laramie. He looked around at the assembled townspeople, his neighbors, his friends. The man standing before you is just a bartender who's learned how to listen better than he shoots. Captain Williams studied Mason thoughtfully. The governor suspected you might say something like that. He asked me to remind you of something you once told him, that a man's worth isn't measured by his reputation, but by what he builds when no one's watching. Mason's eyes widened, slightly recognition and memory playing across his features. James has a good memory. He acknowledged he also said to tell you, Williams continued, that sometimes the best way to bury a legend is to transform it into something else entirely. Eleanor stepped forward, something like hope kindling in her eyes. What exactly would this position entail? Captain Williams turned to her. The marshal would have jurisdiction throughout the territory, but would need a permanent base of operations. Somewhere central perhaps, somewhere peaceful most of the time, but accessible when needed. Somewhere like Sagebrush Creek. Sheriff Thomas suggested, the ghost of a smile playing around his lips. The implications hung in the air, almost tangible. Mason looked from the captain to Thomas, then to Eleanor, his expression thoughtful. You're offering me a way to stay, he said quietly, a way to make the ghost serve a purpose beyond fear. I'm offering you a choice, Williams corrected, between running from who you were and using who you are. The governor believes one is a waste. What do you believe, Mr. Reed? Mason looked to the town council, their expressions ranging from skepticism to cautious hope. He looked to the townspeople, many of whom had only learned his true identity hours ago, and finally he looked to Eleanor, whose eyes held a question only he could answer. I believe, he said slowly, that a man should be judged by what he builds, not what he burns down. He turned to Mayor Simmons. I came to this town looking for anonymity, looking to disappear. What I found instead was a home. He faced the captain again. Tell the governor I'll consider his offer, but on one condition, that my jurisdiction begins and ends with Sagebrush Creek. The ghost may ride when needed, but Mason Reed stays right here behind his bar where he belongs. Captain Williams smiled. I believe the governor will find those terms acceptable. A cheer went up from the crowd, led surprisingly by old Frank, whose weathered face had split into a toothless grin. The tension that had gripped the town since the previous night began to dissipate, like morning fog under the rising sun. Mayor Simmons banged his gavel for order. Well, it seems we have more to discuss than we anticipated. The council will need to vote on whether to accept this arrangement. The hell with voting, Jenkins the blacksmith said gruffly. Man saved our town. Least we can do is let him stay in it. A chorus of agreement followed, and even Herbert Walsh nodded reluctantly. Very well, the mayor conceded. It seems the decision is made. Mason Reed, or whatever name you choose to use, Sagebrush Creek, remains your home. Eleanor moved to Mason's side, her hand finding his. And the ghost? She asked softly. Mason smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes for perhaps the first time since she'd known him. The ghost will guard the living, he replied, not haunt the dead. As the townspeople dispersed, Captain Williams approached Mason once more. The governor mentioned one more thing, he said, about a woman. Rebecca, I believe her name was. Mason's expression stilled, the old shadow passing briefly across his face. He said to tell you that her killer was found 3 years ago, hanged for murder in Denver. She has justice, sir. Perhaps now you can find peace." The captain saluted sharply, then turned to rejoin his men, leaving Mason standing in the dust of the street, the weight of the past lifting from his shoulders with each retreating hoofbeat. 3 months later, the Crossroads Tavern gleamed with fresh paint and new glass. The bullet holes had been plastered over the bloodstains, scrubbed away, but the memory of that night remained not as a wound, but as a story told in hushed voices over amber whiskey. Mason moved behind the bar with the same economical grace he had always possessed, but now there was something different about him. A lightness, perhaps, or simply the absence of a weight he had carried for too long. The badge he wore was small and unobtrusive, pinned to his vest where it caught the light only occasionally, a reminder. Rather than a declaration, Eleanor sat at the far end of the bar reviewing the ledger. As she did every Friday evening, Dr. Wilson and Sheriff Thomas played chess near the window, their game punctuated by good-natured arguments and occasional bursts of laughter. Old Frank nursed his usual at his usual spot, and Charlotte Hayes warmed up near the piano, her voice as sweet and clear as ever. The door swung open, admitting a trio of cowboys, trail dusty and thirsty, their eyes scanning the room with the wariness of men who had heard stories but weren't sure what to believe. "Evening, gentlemen." Mason greeted them, already reaching for clean glasses. "What can I get you?" The oldest of the three approached the bar cautiously. "Heard there was a special kind of place in Sagebrush Creek," he said, studying Mason's face. "A place where a man might find something beyond just whiskey." "And what might that be?" Mason asked, his voice neutral, but his eyes alert. "Peace," the cowboy said simply. "The trail boss said if we behaved ourselves in the desert ghost town, we might find a measure of peace not available elsewhere." Mason set 3 glasses on the bar and filled them with a steady hand. "Your trail boss has an active imagination," he observed, "but he's right about one thing: Sagebrush Creek values its peace." The cowboys relaxed, visibly accepting their drinks with nods of thanks. They moved to a table, their voices dropping to the comfortable murmur of men glad to be off the trail. Eleanor slid down the bar, her ledger forgotten. "That's the 3rd group this week," she said quietly, words spreading. "Good word or bad?" Mason asked, though his slight smile suggested he already knew the answer. "A bit of both." She admitted, "They come looking for the ghost but find Mason Reed instead. Seems to satisfy them well enough." "And when they don't find what they're looking for," he pressed, "when the legend proves to be just a man with a bar and a badge." Eleanor's hand covered his, her fingers warm against his scarred palm. "Then they find something better. Something real." From his chess game by the window, Sheriff Thomas called out, "Mason, tell the doc he can't move his night that way. Man's a physician, not a chess player." "I'm a bartender, not a referee," Mason called back, but he was already moving to join them, his step lighter than it had been in 20 years. As the evening deepened into night, the tavern filled with the usual Friday crowd, ranchers and townspeople, a few travelers passing through, all finding their place in the warm light of the crossroads. The talk flowed as freely as the whiskey stories and laughter mingling in the air like old friends reunited. Only once did the comfortable atmosphere falter, when a young man barely out of his teens approached the bar with the swagger of someone who had practiced his courage in front of a mirror. "They say you're him," he blurted, his hand hovering near the cheap pistol on his hip. The ghost to window. The tavern fell silent, conversations dying. Mid-sentence, as all eyes turned to Mason, he continued polishing the glass in his hand, his movements unhurried. "They say a lot of things," he replied evenly. "Most of them not worth repeating." "They say you're the fastest draw who ever lived," the young man persisted, his voice rising slightly. "That you can shoot a man's gun from his hand at 50 paces. Mason set the glass down gently. "And why would that interest you?" he asked, his voice carrying a new quality, not threatening exactly, but containing the promise that a threat might exist if one looked for it. The young man hesitated, suddenly aware of the attention he had drawn. "I just wanted to know if it was true." Mason studied him for a long moment, seeing in the boy's face the same hunger for significance that had once driven him into a life of gunsmoke and legend. "Let me ask you something," he said finally. "What's your name, son?" "William," the boy answered, confusion replacing bravado. "William Tanner." "Well, William Tanner, let me tell you what's true." Mason leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping so that the young man had to lean in to hear him. "What's true is that there's nothing romantic about putting bullets in other men. What's true is that every man I ever outdrew left behind someone who loved him and something that died with him. What's true is that at your age, I thought speed and skill with a gun would make me someone worth remembering." William's eyes widened slightly. "And did it?" "It made me someone worth forgetting," Mason replied with a gentleness that took the sting from the words. "It made me a ghost before I was dead, a name whispered around campfires to frighten children and fools." He straightened, gesturing to the tavern around them. "This is what's worth building. Son, a place where people gather because they want to, not because they're afraid to stay away. A community that stands together when trouble comes. A life that leaves something behind besides notches on a gun." The young man looked around the room at the faces watching him, not with hostility, but with something like patient understanding. "I heard you were dangerous," he said finally. "I am," Mason agreed, "but not in the way you're looking for." He reached beneath the bar and produced a glass, setting it before the young man. "First drinks on the house. After that, you pay your way like everyone else." "Shitty." William nodded slowly, a new kind of respect dawning in his eyes. "Yes, sir." As the young man took his drink to a table, conversation gradually resumed. Eleanor appeared at Mason's side, her eyes warm with something that might have been pride. "That was well handled," she murmured. "Practice." Mason shrugged. 5 years of listening taught me something about what young men like that really need to hear." "And what's that?" "That there's a difference between being seen and being known, between being feared and being respected." He smiled slightly. "Between being a legend and being a man." The tavern door opened again, admitting Captain Williams, now dressed in civilian clothes, trail dust marking him as just arrived. He nodded to Mason and made his way to the bar. "Marshal," he greeted formally, though his eyes twinkled. "Captain." Mason returned, already reaching for a bottle. "What brings you back to our quiet corner of the territory?" Williams accepted the offered drink with a nod of thanks. "Orders from the governor. He's heard about what you've built here, a town where the law is respected without being feared. A place where even the roughest cowboys mind their manners." He raised his glass slightly. He thinks it's a model worth studying. "There's not much to study," Mason said. "Just a town that decided peace was worth protecting. And a man who found a way to use his shadow to shelter rather than frighten." Eleanor added, joining them. "Welcome back, Captain. Will you be staying long?" "Just passing through this time," Williams replied. "But I'll be back. The governor is considering establishing a training program for territorial marshals. He'd like it based here under Marshal Reed's supervision." Mason's eyebrows rose slightly. "James is getting ahead of himself. I'm just a bartender with a badge, not a teacher." From what I've seen, Williams disagreed. "You've been teaching this town for 5 years, teaching them how to build something worth protecting, how to become more than just another dusty crossroads waiting for trouble to find it." He set a folded paper on the bar. "The governor's proposal. Read it when you have time." As Williams moved away to find a table, Eleanor glanced at the document. What will you tell him?" Mason's eyes swept the tavern, this place he had built, these people who had accepted him, despite knowing what he had been, what he could still become if pushed. His gaze lingered on Sheriff Thomas, still bickering good-naturedly with Dr. Wilson over their chess game. On old Frank, quietly content in his corner. On Charlotte, her voice lifting in a song about redemption and second chances. Finally, his eyes returned to Eleanor, who had stood beside him through darkness and light, who had seen both the ghost and the man, and chosen to believe in the latter, even when he himself could not. "I'll tell him," Mason said softly, "that the desert ghost died 5 years ago in Laramie, but Mason Reed is just beginning to live." Outside, the wind whispered across the prairie. carrying away old legends and bringing new stories to take their place. And in the warm light of the Crossroads Tavern, a man who had once been a shadow found himself fully visible, at last seen not for the legend he had been, but for the life he had built, one quiet day, one poured drink, one kept promise at a time. The desert ghost was gone laid to rest, not by a bullet or a hangman's noose, but by something far more powerful, the choice to become something better than a legend, something real, something human. And in that humanity, Mason Reed had found what he had sought for 20 years without realizing it. Not peace as the absence of violence, but peace as the presence of purpose. Not invisibility, but belonging. Not the whispered fear of a ghost story, but the quiet respect of a community he had helped to build and would continue to protect. Not with the speed of his draw, but with the strength of his conviction that some things were worth more than legends. Some things were worth coming home for. The setting sun casts long shadows across Sagebrush Creek's main street as Mason Reed stands on the porch of the Crossroads Tavern. The badge on his chest catches the dying light. Not a burden anymore, but a choice. 5 years tending bar, he says to Eleanor, his voice carrying the weathered certainty of a man who's finally found his true north. Seems I was just pouring drinks until I found something worth fighting for. The distant rumble of horses approaches not enemies this time, but travelers seeking the legendary town where law and order prevail without a daily gunfight, where the infamous desert ghost traded his notoriety for something real. Eleanor's hand finds his. They come for the legend, she says, but stay for the man. Inside, Sheriff Thomas raises his glass in a silent toast. Old Frank dozes contentedly in his corner, a patriot's dream realized in whiskey and sacrifice. Mason Reed watches the sunset with the steady gaze of a marksman who no longer needs to prove his aim. Some men chase glory until it kills them. The wisest ones know when they've found something worth living for instead. Freedom, honor, home. Some battles are won with bullets. The important ones are won with courage.